Hello everybody, it's Wendy Adler bringing you an articulating art talk once again. We were going to film outside today, but it was kind of rainy and stormy, so we're back in my dining room studio with Michael, my cameraman. I'm wearing my peasant blouse and my pearls because we're going to talk about two Dutch artists from the Golden Age, Pieter Bruegel and Johannes Vermeer. So peasants are the Bruegel part, pearls are the Vermeer part. But I want to start a little bit about where we are in history right now. So Michelangelo, the rock star of the 1500s, has become a celebrity in Italy at this point. If you remember, he lived quite a long life, and his sculptures and his Sistine Chapel were very well reputed at that point. And Pieter Bruegel is born in the early 1500s, so just after Michelangelo's fame. There are big differences, though, between Italian art and the Flemish art of the day. Italian art was all about idealism and grandeur and making things pretty. And the Dutch art was more about everyday life. One of the big key differences was in the way the Italians and the Flemish decorated their churches. The Italian churches were decorated with a lot of painted ceilings and friezes on the wall, while the Dutch had a lot of stained glass. Why? Well, because in Italy, they had a lot more wall, and in the Dutch churches, they had a lot more windows due to the sloped roofs that they needed because of their weather in the wintertime. So the Italian art and the Flemish art differed very strongly right there in their religious art. The Netherlands and that region was referred to as Flanders, and so that's where we get the term Flemish painting and Flemish art. Flemish is, I don't know, somebody made up the word Flemish to describe Flanders in that region. So Italy and Flanders were very large centers of commerce and culture in those days. King Philip of Spain had collected a lot of works, specifically by Hieronymus Bosch, who we've talked about before as well. And Bosch comes into play quite a bit when we talk about Bruegel, as you'll see later. So let's talk about Pieter Bruegel now. Pieter Bruegel was born in 1525 and died in 1569. He married kind of late in life, and he had two sons, but died while the children were still young. Both of those boys went on to become artists, and so you may hear Pieter Bruegel the elder and Pieter Bruegel the younger, and then Jan. So there's three artists in the Bruegel family, but Pieter Bruegel the elder was the one that started everything off. The name Bruegel came from the village he was born in. We've heard that before with other artists, such as Rembrandt. And it was spelled with an H originally. It would have been spelled B-R-U-E-G-H-E-L. But Bruegel the artist dropped the H as time went on. Bruegel studies with an artist of the day. I don't know his name offhand. He does end up marrying his master artist's daughter, so she ends up being the mother of his children. Most of Bruegel's paintings were held in private collections, so he was not particularly well known in his day as a painter. He was really known more as a comic etcher. He would design actually cartoons for the day, and those etchings would be made into prints, and people knew of him from those etchings. And I'll show you shortly one of the plates from those etching series. He did become a master painter in Antwerp in 1551. Little side note, the term masterpiece comes from the designation of a piece of art that somebody aspiring to be a master painter would have submitted for consideration for that designation. So masterpiece came from somebody trying to be a master painter. Just a little side note there. Bruegel liked to paint the everyman. A few things to remember about Bruegel's general subject matter. He liked to paint landscapes, Peasants and Proverbs. He stayed away from religious subject matter for the most part, but once in a while there were some moral adages in his work, and I'll point those out when we talk about one of his pieces. Bruegel does travel to France and Italy, and he does make some sketches from those trips. He works for a famous engraver of the day. This is where he gets his etching training. And he prepares the drawings for two particular series. One was called The Seven Deadly Sins. The other was called The Virtues. This is a plate from The Virtues. If you look at this closely, you might swear that you were looking at an Hieronymus Bosch picture, because a lot of those same strange figures that we saw, for example, in the Garden of Earthly Delights, show up in this picture. So why? Why do we think that Bruegel and Bosch have so many similarities? Probably because Bruegel was instructed to make his drawings and his etchings similar to Bosch. Bosch had gained quite a bit of popularity in the 1500s. We knew that the king liked Bosch's style and owned several of his paintings, and so Bruegel was probably instructed to draw like Bosch, which is why we have some of those similar figures in that Virtues picture. However, Bruegel was more focused on the everyman. You might remember in Bosch's triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, it's a whole portrayal of heaven and hell. Bruegel stays away from the portrayals of heaven and hell, but he does intermingle some religious content into his work, and I'll show you that in just a moment. He often went out into the country to see what the everyman was doing, and really he was one of the first people to present the genre, as our type in Toast Points sometimes refers to. You might recall that genre would be a picture of everyday man doing everyday things. Recently we talked about Velázquez and his work Old Lady Frying Eggs. You might recall it was literally a picture of an old woman frying eggs. Bruegel took that same everyday activity, not frying eggs, but that everyday activity, and worked it into most of his works. So let's talk about this picture here. We have a lot of people in this picture, don't we? And yet it doesn't seem particularly chaotic. There was a particular term for this kind of picture. It was called wimmelbeeld, which is a Dutch word which means teeming figures. A picture with a lot of different figures in it. This is definitely in that definition. We talked about the fact that Bruegel in his work uses a lot of landscape, peasants, and proverbs, and he in fact did do a wimmelbeeld picture of proverbs. This one, however, is called Children's Games. Children's Games was done in 1560. It is oil on a wooden oak panel. The wooden oak panel would have had to have been aged for about 10 years before he was able to use it as his canvas in this case. The picture in real life is quite large. It's about 46 inches by 63 inches, so 4 foot by 5 foot. And it hangs currently in a museum in Vienna. And if we look at this picture, what do we see? Well, we see a lot of recognizable, even today, games that would be played by people, particularly by children. We have somebody over here pitching balls. We have hoops being played with by some people down here. We have leapfrog, we have hide and seek, we have jacks, we have all kinds of games, and the longer you study this picture, the more you might be able to actually pick out. Everybody in this picture is more or less captured in action, and yet I don't sense a lot of kineticism in this picture. It's kind of a quiet kineticism. We definitely have energy and action, but it's not real fast-paced. It doesn't have a lot of shadow. The perspective is a little bit funny, don't you think? The perspective is actually more as if we're looking at this picture kind of from above, maybe from a balcony of a building and looking down on a town square. So the perspective here is a little strange. We definitely see a lot of people. It's almost like its own miniature world, right? And like Bosch's work, the longer we look at a Bruegel picture like this, the more we would notice, the more narration we would come up with. We would definitely be able to tell our own stories here. I want to show you another one of his works. This is called the Numbering at Bethlehem, or sometimes referred to as the Census at Bethlehem. This one was done about 6 years later, 1566, and it's showing a winter town scene here. The style is called mannerism. We have not talked about that before. Mannerism means that the main subject of the picture is put off center to this composition. So that's a clue as to what we're doing, along with the title, of course, Numbering or Census at Bethlehem. So why Bethlehem? Especially why Bethlehem when what we're looking at is probably Dutch landscape and Dutch town, not Bethlehem? Well, off center, right here, we have Mary. Mary riding on a donkey, a pregnant Mary riding on a donkey, leading an oxen, two traditional manger animals, right? And she's being led over here to what looks like a town hall type of city meeting place where they're taking a census for tax collection. And yet Mary is being somewhat ignored. She's at the back of the pack. We wouldn't even notice her necessarily if I didn't point her out. So what is he saying in this picture? Well, as I said, he likes to kind of work proverbs and morals into some of his work without really taking a religious position. What would be the moral or the proverb in here? Well, maybe it's the indifference that people showed to Mary in the traditional Bible story. Nobody's really paying any attention to her here, and yet she's pregnant riding a donkey. Maybe she needed some help, and all these people are ignoring her. So I think that there was a lesson in there, but it was a very subtle lesson. We know that only 45 of Bruegel the Elder's works have survived, so you probably haven't had the opportunity to see one in person unless you've been in various European museums before. So let's move on and let's talk a little more now about Holland history and about what was going on from a historical context, because even though that doesn't fit neatly into our TOAST acronym, historical context, of course, becomes very important. Holland had become a powerhouse nation and came out from under Spanish rule around 1609. The Dutch painters then entered what we call the Dutch Golden Age of painting. So Bruegel and Vermeer kind of are the bookends for that Dutch Golden Age of painting. And then it came to an abrupt stop. Rembrandt would be the most famous painter from that period, but certainly Bruegel and Vermeer would be in the conversation. I have a quote here. "Do you know an artist called Vermeer? This strange painter's palette consists of blue, lemon yellow, pearl gray, black, and white." That was a quote from a letter that Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo. Interesting that Van Gogh would have noticed Vermeer's work because Vermeer was not well known in his day. So let's talk a little more about Vermeer. He was born in 1632 and died in 1675. He's nicknamed the Sphinx of Delft because there was very little known about him. We don't have any sketchbooks from him, and we only have about 30 to 40 actual attributed works to Vermeer. He was born in Delft during this golden age of great prosperity in Holland, and the year after he's born, Rembrandt paints the Anatomy of Dr. Tulp. Now, if you've been to my previous talks, you may recall that we talked about the Anatomy of Dr. Tulp. That was a picture that Rembrandt painted as an honorary picture for Dr. Tulp. It was going to be displayed in the Medical Academy, and it showed a group of doctors gathered around a cadaver that was being dissected by Dr. Tulp. This was a frighteningly different art picture than what most people had seen at that point. It was not really a genre. It was definitely not a nice, neat portrait the way that the Italian beauties were painted. And so I think that Vermeer and Bruegel responded to that by painting the everyman and painting in a genre mode. So a lot of Vermeer's portraits are definitely prettier than the Dr. Tulp portrait, but they would have come from that inspiration. So Holland at this time has a mercantile-driven upper and middle class. They have a lot of very neat homes that needed some degree of decoration, and art was readily available. The art market was actually oversaturated. And with what? Well, it was oversaturated with artists kind of like we have today. These were people that would paint, and they would sell their works on street fairs, at farmers markets. It was displayed oftentimes in bars and pubs, and perhaps bought right off the wall of those institutions. Vermeer's father was actually a pub owner and an art dealer. So Vermeer would have been exposed to art that was hanging in his father's bar. We think that perhaps he was even exposed to the work of Caravaggio. And so the sense of dark and light, that chiaroscuro effect that Caravaggio is known so well for, does show up in Vermeer's work, but in a much more subtle, kind of quiet way. One of the quotes from the critics of the day said, "A work of art is a fragment of nature seen through a temperament." A work of art is a fragment of nature seen through a temperament. That's a pretty cool quote. You can even apply that quote today, but that was made back in the day. So I want to show you one of Vermeer's early works that you probably would never label as a Vermeer. We have this work here. This is called the Procuress. And what are we looking at here? Well, part of the reason you probably wouldn't attribute this to Vermeer is because, first of all, it's kind of a dark background. There's none of that beautiful window light radiating. But really, it's the subject matter that's kind of interesting. We know that Vermeer liked to paint people, but this is actually a picture about a courtesan, shall we say, a mercenary, somebody that was actually selling sex for money at the day. And this would have been a very recognizable topic, which is probably why he chose to paint it, even though it's interesting that he steers away from anything tawdry later, right? So let's talk a little more about that. That was painted in 1656, by the way. Vermeer is known for the world of the sunlit room. And in that picture, the Procuress, we don't see any sunlit room. So let me put up a piece that'll show us something maybe a little more typical when you think of Vermeer. Right? So this one is called the Milkmaid. This was done in 1660. It's also known as the Maidservant pouring milk. Okay, no mystery as to what this is. And this one hangs in the Rijksmuseum. In real life, it's only about 18 inches by 16 inches, so it's quite small. So obviously my reproduction is much larger than that. We have very realistic fabrics, right? You can almost want to reach out and touch those fabrics. The corset or the bodice of the woman's dress, it looks like maybe a rougher type of muslin or a linen. It doesn't have any sort of satiny smoothness or velvety look to the way that it's painted, but the color itself is very nice. We do have a much richer color in the skirt in that beautiful blue. Look at the texture of the bread. Holy moly, it looks like it's crusty enough to just reach out and take a bite, doesn't it? We have a lot of detail in this picture. We have nail holes all around the wall, and those are not mistakes. Those are actually probably what the studio looked like. We have wicker on this basket that's hanging on the wall. We have beautiful reflection from this metal vessel here. And that's all coming from the light source of the window, with those very detailed window panes, with the light shining this direction. That was a typical pose of Vermeer's. He would typically have the light source, the window, over on the left, with the light coming towards the right. He does not show a strong sense of chiaroscuro in this picture, but he uses the light in a much softer way, right? We have some contrast, but no real deep, dark shadows like we had in that Procuress picture. We do have some shadow here from this metal thing hanging on the wall, but we have a very restful and serene sense of what's going on here. We think that Vermeer used to use a camera obscura, which would have been new technology of the day. And I'm not really going to try to explain to you how a camera obscura works because I'm sure I'm going to mess it up. But suffice it to say that it was a technological device that you covered your head with a drape, and there were mirrors inside of the box, and the mirrors reflected upside down and backwards what you were seeing in front of you. I think that the point of using it would have been for the artist to be able to see the objects or the subjects more as shapes, kind of objectively, instead of subjectively. So it is rumored that Vermeer would have been one of the first artists to use camera obscura as one of his tools. Okay? We also have some allegory in this picture that you may not have picked up on down here in the corner. We have what looks like a box, and it's open on the end here. And we have a little ceramic tile here at the baseboard, or what would have been the baseboard at the time. The ceramic tile has a picture of a Cupid painted on it. But what is this box? Well, the box is a foot warmer. And the foot warmer would have been put in this picture to represent love and the warmth that one gets when they think of love. So that gives us a clue as to what Vermeer wanted us to think when we looked at this picture. He wanted us to think of this milkmaid, probably a servant, and she was caught in a daydream or a reverie of love, which is dictated by our foot warmer and our little Cupid down here at the bottom. So he kind of almost had a hidden message in this picture for us. Now let's move on to the one that you're all waiting for and why I wore my pearl earrings. Girl with a pearl earring, which actually is not what this is called. It's called that now because Tracy Chevalier released a book titled Girl with a Pearl Earring back in the 90s. So that's how we all know the piece now. But it's actually titled Girl with a Blue Turban. Okay? So Girl with a Pearl Earring, which is what we will affectionately refer to her as, was painted in 1665-ish. We aren't 100% certain of the date, but it is oil on canvas. It's in real life only about 18 inches by 15 inches, so it is small, similar to one of the other ones I showed you. And it was given to the Hague Museum in 1882 by a collector who had bought it cheap and then donated it to the Hague because it was in poor condition. Now obviously it will have been restored by now, but you can even in this restoration or reproduction, excuse me, you can even see the crackling that was occurring in the glaze on this work. Okay, so we have our lovely young maiden staring longingly at we don't know what. This picture was painted in what we call a trony style. And we talked about tronies before when we talked about Rembrandt. You might recall Rembrandt used to dress up in costumes when he was doing his portraits of people. This woman is in a costume. This is not what she would have been wearing walking around in the streets of the Netherlands in the 1600s. So a trony is basically an idealized portrayal of a character. Okay, so this woman is painted as a character, actually young girl, not even a woman yet. We think this may have been one of Vermeer's daughters. Vermeer had 15 children. You may or may not recall I said that before. 15 children, so he always had a model available, right? We see in this picture a dark background. Again, something that Vermeer didn't usually use. We saw that in the Procuress a little bit, but he only painted a dark background, I think, in one other portrait other than this one. We also don't really see any outlines. This is a very soft, serene gaze of a young woman in almost a voluptuous position. Her lips are parted, her eyes are staring off into we don't know what. But it's the pearl here in the center of the work that is meant to draw our focus. He painted that pearl and that beautiful luminescence of it by layering the paint next to each other in very small points, almost like a pointillist effect, kind of like Georges Seurat did in the 1800s. But this is in the 1600s, remember. So his technique was very unusual. He also doesn't use very strong chiaroscuro, just like we pointed out in our Milkmaid. We have some shadows, but not real strong ones, right? Everything in this picture is very soft and serene. I want to talk about one more Vermeer work. This is one of my favorites. This one is called An Artist in His Studio. It's also called Allegory of Painting. So we've talked about what an allegory is before. In fact, allegory is one of our toast points. It's the A in toast points for allegorical or realistic. An allegory is something represented in a work by a symbol. So in our Milkmaid, we had the little foot warmer and Cupid representing love. But this picture is chock full of allegory. So let's go ahead and dissect this one a little bit. We have our pretty young lady here, and she's holding a book, and she's got a laurel wreath on her head, which happens to be exactly what part of the painting the artist is working on here. She's holding a trumpet, and she's positioned in front of a wall hanging that shows the map of the Netherlands. So what kind of story is he trying to tell us here? Well, the laurel wreath represents glory, and the trumpet represents fame. So the glory and the fame of the country is being represented in this picture. We also are looking at the back of the artist. This is presumably a self-portrait of the back of Vermeer, working in his studio. We have the typical window or light source on the left coming towards the right. And he has literally drawn back the curtain on the process that an artist would go through in painting a portrait. So we have our curtain over there on the left side, depicted with a lot of detail and lushness. It looks like a real heavy kind of a velvet material. We have the hardness of the table and the stool. We have the canvas set up here. We have a little bit of reflection on the trim of a chair over here. We have a strong black and white floor. So you can look at this and you can see by the softness in the woman's face, it does resemble other Vermeer characters, and with that light kind of crossing from left to right. But this is a really interesting painting to study. I want to read you a quote here. It says, "Other pictorial arts are inadequate in their imitation of nature. Such products will always look like a piece of crafted stone or clay, a piece of paper with lines, or a woven textile. Whereas painting can even imitate those works of art, while the reverse is impossible to achieve. Only painting can create the illusion of a perfectly convincing space filled with light, of all those different kinds of materials, substances, and textiles, and of the human figure in its most beautiful and transient form, that of a young woman." I think that quote does a great job of summing up what we're seeing here in this picture. One allegorical point that I forgot to show, up in the chandelier here, which has such beautiful reflection, right, is a two-headed eagle as part of the chandelier. It's hard to see, but the two-headed eagle would have represented the Habsburg rulers of Spain. So Vermeer here is making nice to those Spanish rulers. This was one of his later works, one of his last works actually, because Vermeer of course died in 1675. In 1672, the French begin an invasion on the Dutch, and it results in an immediate decline in the country's prosperity and in their art market. Vermeer was widely unrecognized outside of the Netherlands until the late 1800s. He was brought to the attention of Europeans then by a French critic who discovered one of his works and proclaimed him a genius and began to write about him. Vermeer is only credited with about 30 to 40 works. He didn't help his cause by signing all of his works in a different way. We know that there were at least 7 different signatures that he used in his work. And so when we're trying to verify a Vermeer, it's very difficult, especially because Vermeer forgeries were rampant as well. We do know for a fact of at least 21 of his works because the provenance of them is in a catalog that was put together by his widow after his death. When he died, he left his family penniless, 15 mouths to feed, remember, and so the widow had to sell some of his works, and so she put together 21 of his pieces in a catalog and sold them off for $300 a piece. Yeah, it would have been quite a bargain, right? So the works that were in that catalog are easy to verify. The works that were not in that catalog are a little harder to pinpoint. He was the subject of many forgery attempts, particularly in the 1940s by a Dutch artist whose name was Han van Meegeren. And Meegeren apparently got away with these forgeries for quite some time, but of course now technology has allowed us to detect that kind of stuff a lot easier. After Vermeer, the Dutch artists actually steered more towards a Van Gogh style of work. I have an example here by the Dutch artist Frans Hals, H-A-L-S. And if you look at Hals' work here, it almost looks like the Potato Eaters from Van Gogh, doesn't it? We have that dark, kind of bland color palette, and we have the face that almost looks like a caricature, kind of like the Potato Eaters that Van Gogh did. So we can see that the Dutch art kind of went in a different direction after Vermeer and after the Dutch golden age of art. I hope you enjoyed our talk today. I certainly enjoyed talking about these two artists, and I look forward to the time that I can be back in front of you and having more interactive discussion about our art. Please stay well, send me your feedback and comments, and I will bring you another video soon. Take care.